Faces and chapters from the Central European legal heritage. Welcome to the Central European Legal Insight, the podcast series introducing the professors of the Central European Academy at the University of Miskolc through insightful conversations with Judit Varga.
This is an ongoing discussion about the identity of Europe. What actually constitutes the identity of Europe? And the most of authors insist on the secularity and secularization as the resolution or the best way to express the European identity. However, the idea of secularity, of secular state, also has Christian roots. So if you have security threats, you have actually individuals that you can identify, and there is no need to punish the whole community. Mm-hmm. Maybe I think that would be the better way to solve this kind of problems. I think the worst thing to do is to make limitations on religious freedom, because religious freedom is a taproot of all other freedoms. Taproot is the main root that plants have, and then you have other smaller one. In my case, I can say that Central European Academy had a lifelong impact. So this cooperation, even if we stop it now, has had enough influence on me that will remain until the end of my career.
Welcome to Central European Legal Insights, the podcast series of the Central European Academy at the University of Miskolc. My name is Judit Varga and I work as a senior mentor at the Academy, and I will be your host in this podcast. In each episode, we are presenting the faces and the personalities of the Central European Professors Network. And through friendly conversations, we would like to bring you closer to the very rich diversity of Central Europe's legal heritage. Also, we explore the stories and ideas beyond science that connect us in this region. So with this introduction, I warmly welcome in the studio Professor Dr. Dalibor Đukić, who is an associate professor and vice dean for international cooperation at the Faculty of Law at the University of Belgrade, Serbia. Dear Professor, we are honored to have you here.
Thank you, dear Judith. It's my pleasure to be here today with you and with your viewers and listeners.
Dear Professor, dear Dalibor, we are going to tackle extremely relevant and significant issues ranging from Christianity in Europe, freedom of religion and migration challenges, especially in this central and eastern part of the continent. And again, we are grateful for our long cooperation within the Academy, and we do look forward to future endeavors. Dear Dalibor, let's start with the warming up questions. I would like to ask you to present yourself, because now today you are the face of Serbia and the Serbian legal science, especially in this very, very interesting and unique area or domain of law. And I would like to ask you about your background. Why did you choose to become a lawyer? What is the highlights of your professional career, which you are the most proud of? And how did you end up with the Academy?
Thank you first of all for providing this platform or this place for Central European professors to be able to express themselves and to share their views and opinions with a wider audience. Usually we are somehow closed in our amphitheaters and classrooms, so it is nice to get this chance to speak for not only for a national audience but also for international audience.
Worldwide.
Worldwide, yes, exactly. I remember when I was 15 years old or something like that, there was a movie which starts with a small kid that says, "My father is a liar," and then from the background, you can hear his mom and says, "He's a lawyer." Okay, so it was to choose between liar or lawyer somehow. But there are some theories that lawyers must be good liars, and quite the opposite. I think that my vision and what I would like to contribute to the legal science is that lawyers must be connected pretty much with the truth. And there is always this huge question, what is the truth? I don't want to open it at this moment of our discussion, maybe later. However, the reason that probably I decided to be connected with the law in general is that lawyers are like blood in human body. You know, it gets everywhere, and the health of the body depends mostly on the quality of the blood. You know, of course, there are some diseases that do not that are not connected with the quality of the blood, but still, you know, lawyers get to the every single piece of the society,
and they have to be the masters of everything.
Of course,
because if a carpenter comes into the law firm for seeking for advice, then partly we have to become a carpenter in order to be able to understand and identify yourself with his or her problem. So sorry for interrupting, but I have this kind of similarity. But the blood parallel is also a very good one.
Yes, I think so. There are that it really express this because you know the blood is somehow connected with the life. You know, it is a symbol of life, and law and lawyers somehow are also symbol of the statehood and the living state. You know, and also the symbol of successful society as well. If you have good lawyers, if you have good legal system. That is probably the best sign of the wealthy and healthy society. So that is something that was my inspiration to deal with the legal sciences. Furthermore, I'm sure that many of your viewers know that our region. The region of Central Europe or Western Balkans and Balkans in general still suffer from some kind of integration into the European Union and not so Central European countries, but Western Balkans countries. And we are still in this long process of negotiations for the accession. So without lawyers who are ready to deal with the European law as well, I think that this goal that is official goal of all those countries.
In your daily activities, do you sorry
hard to achieve? Yeah, sorry.
In your daily activities, do you deal with European law as well as a practical instrument?
No, I do not deal with European law so much. Actually, my domain, as you mentioned, is more connected with human rights and protection of religious freedom, actually. So, of course, there are some issues interesting, and I think that we will analyze some of them, or speak about them. But never mind, it becomes very important for Western Balkan countries, the implementation of European laws and European acquis communautaire.
It's a constant task.
It is,
and it's a never-ending task even after accession.
Yes.
Then you have to always.
But it is very important to be prepared for the accession. if you take the example of Greece, for example, if we can give that as an example.
Yeah, you are you know a lot about the Greek legal system.
In Greece,
you speak fluent Greek and also ancient Greek.
Yes,
if I read your CV properly.
Thank you. Okay, I can't say it's Greek to me because I do understand Greek, but they entered into the Eurozone in 2000. In only 8 years or 9 years, they faced bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. So if you are not prepared properly to enter the club, to enter the EU or to enter the Eurozone, whatever, it can be very dangerous, actually. So this preparation is maybe more important than we think it is. Mm-hmm. And probably there are other examples in Europe that we can find that when you join the common market and the free market and so on, there is a question how to protect your own local products and production and so forth. I'm not an expert for that field, but I can feel it. I can see it, and I can identify that as an issue.
Actually, from this point of view, although you are waiting in the corridor for so long time, I think it's irrealistically long since the accession request and how you can proceed with the opening of the new chapters in the West Balkan countries. But still, some good thing in the bad situation that you have a lot of positions and precedents already ahead of you to analyze before you enter the club. What are the consequences? What are the rationalities once you are a member of the club? So you can really prepare in advance, not only with your legal compliance, but also with your decision-making method, the consequences of European decision, and how to protect your national, economic, social, etc. interests. So
yes,
this might have this advantage.
Maybe this is an advantage of the worst kid in the class. He always knows what happened with the rest of his class because they all left and they went to the next grade. I did not
qualify anyone as a bad or good student, but still this waiting room gives the opportunity to study and analyze the future in depth.
That is truth, and I think that this is one of the tasks of Central European Academy, the work that we have here. Especially, I know that my colleagues were participating in few different projects regarding the European law, and especially they described the Serbian experience of European integration.
Yes, I also had the pleasure to interview Mr. Vladan Petrov from your country, Constitutional Court Judge, and it was a very valuable discussion about the integration process of your country. But sorry to interrupt you, but you are very special for us because you contributed to one of our most relevant books, which is the Constitutional Protection of Religious Symbols. And here I would like to come back to your background or curriculum. Was there a moment where you decided, like an enlightenment, that I want to deal with Christianity or religious freedom?
Okay, maybe this I do not have to provide some special information about
just,
that I met with Jesus or something like that. No, I did not have that kind of experiences. But simply, yes, there is. I have a strong connection with the Orthodox Church and with my Orthodox community, and the faith, any faith. Takes the whole of the human being. You cannot be partially Christian, like every faith has this, let's say,
exclusivity or
yes, it is exclusivity somehow, but also it tends to it tries to affect all of your life. So you cannot say, I don't know, I'm Christian today during the service or the sermon, and then when I go to my home, I will not be anymore Christian, and now I can do whatever I want.
It determines your mentality, your nature, your character.
Everything, yes, character. And to some extent, even your professional career. That is what happened with me, actually, that when it started, when you become more involved with your faith and you start to read and to be interested in some faith issues, then it just takes all of your life, and including your family life, your what you eat, what you drink, what you dress, what you read, and what you
two things come to my mind based on what you just said, that we usually say that in Europe even the atheists are Christians, because the rhythm and the pace of our everyday living is determined by the Christian culture, which is rooted in 2000-year culture, and this is how we organize our life, our working hours. Maybe this was a right statement up until recently, but this is also under pressure, and we are going to tackle this. Especially, I have my own experience in Europe, especially in Western Europe. But I just would like to ask about the popularity of this branch of law, because you are a young gentleman, and unfortunately, Christianity is not as popular today in Europe as it was many decades ago. And what is your experience being a young teacher? Is it attractive to other or to young fellows, young researchers to follow this direction?
Fortunately, it is. Maybe it sounds that for many decades, in many different countries, people believe that religion is the matter of the past, and that in the 21st century there won't be any religion, and people will be liberated from religious believings and so on. But actually, we saw something completely different, that during the beginning, at least, of the 21st century, in some Eastern European countries, religion, this revival of religion, was obvious. And I think that my experience, at least, is around the globe, you can find experts dealing with law and religion. And this new, let's say, field of legal studies that is named law and religion is actually flourishing in many countries. So from the United States, that are traditionally very interested in these issues, then in Europe, you cannot understand many political and geopolitical issues if you do not deal with religion. For example, the war in Ukraine, it has a strong religious background. If you see the situation in the Middle East, of course, it's obvious that there is a religion behind the conflicts and so forth. In modern societies as well, religion is hidden somehow behind many decisions that are made, and it may be so. This new field is really attractive, and at my faculty, actually, we have always students who choose my field to write their master thesis or to prepare a PhD. And we're dealing with many different issues. For example, I have a very good student who is now preparing. She's not still writing her PhD, but the general theme is law and supernatural. Law and supernaturality. Law yes. And I don't know how to express it, but young generations, I think they do not have anymore this feeling that Christianity is something not popular anymore. Maybe it is not popular, it is not part of the popular culture, of course, but it is not, at least in Serbia and in many other countries in the region, it is not so strange if you have a friend who is I don't know, fasting, or who goes every Sunday to church or something like that. It is not anymore that, and I think in Serbia especially, young generations have this because of the religious instruction in schools. That is also one of the issues that we deal with, because it can be there are always different opinions about religious instruction. Does it violate the secularity of the state? What about the neutrality of the state? Is it religious indoctrination of children, and so forth? There are many interesting questions about religious instruction, but I think that this religious instruction that has been taught in Serbia since 2000 made the difference.
You feel that you really made an impact, especially with your special field of interest?
It's hard to say because this needs a kind of self-criticism and
but we have to be also brave enough to highlight those moments in our lives. And when you felt in the room that you said something like a statement where there was an aha moment in the room, or people really went into the deepest part of your message. So or because talking about Christianity, I often had this feeling that it was not so common, and we are so rational, especially lawyers, and referring to something higher or some.
But Christianity is rational. Actually, I know that there is this, unfortunately, I would say, false believing that Christians are irrational, or they live in their own world that is that has actually nothing to do with the modern world and with the modern way of life. But I think that is just a misunderstanding of the real reality. Sometimes when we have meetings, at the faculty or somewhere else, and when I ask something that is very rational, they say, "Oh, we didn't expect from you to ask that." That is a common thing that happens to me. But do you think that Christians would survive 2,000 years if they were irrational?
Yeah, no.
I don't think so. And they survive not only in Europe, where they are majority still, in some countries not anymore, but they survived in the Middle East. They survived in in places where other religious groups or other religious movements that were not majority ceased to exist centuries ago. So if they were irrational, I don't think they would survive.
And do you also deal with the persecution of Christians around the world, on this phenomenon?
A little bit, yes, because some statistical data actually say that Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world. Of course, they are the majority in the world, but still, if you compare the numbers, the number of Christians that is under persecution is much higher than the number of other faiths.
Yes, Hungary is running a program, the Hungary Helps program, to help those in these conflict areas where Christians are persecuted. We would like to bring help locally.
I know very well about that program. I think that if I remember well, Hungarian help was sent to Syria, to Muslims in Syria.
To rebuild churches, schools, pipelines, what is needed. And then, Dalibor, sorry for interrupting, but I just can't wait to jump into this extremely exciting topic of Christian values. And we would start, what do you think a Christian value is? And, what is the role of Christian values in today's legal systems, especially in Central Europe? But first we have to define the value.
What Christian values are. And there is no, of course, something like definition. Christians were not sitting down and thinking about how we should define our values, but our values are products of our way of life, and this has started 2,000 years ago, and those values, of course, have changed. They were not always the same, but they are based on the same moral and ethical, if you want, rules. And you can identify this kind of values in modern constitutions, and not only. They are. The problem is that usually they are perceived not as Christian values, but as values of some other moments of human history. For example, of French Revolution. So if you say equality, the first thing is the first probably impression would be, okay, that is what French Revolution brought to us. But equality is a value, has roots much deeper than French Revolution. I do not deny that French Revolution was based on that was one on demands of people who initiated it revolution, but still the idea of equality among people has been written first of all in the New Testament, and was later elaborated by Christian holy fathers, as we call them. So I do not see any reason why we should forget all that part of our history and just erase that and say, okay, this is something new, something that we have never heard of before that.
And here comes my question, but you can then continue your track. But I'm so curious, and what is the situation in those regions of the world where Christianity is not the root of the culture, and they still have legal systems, and they are also belonging to the universal world of the human rights. So how shall we, deal with this phenomenon?
Of course, but there is one difference between Europe and the rest of the world. The idea of these human rights actually has started here. It is European and, if you want, Christian project. It has roots here. I think the answer on your question could be given by the theory of legal transplants of Alan Watson. Legal transplants. Transplants, yes. So it is a very nice theory that actually the most important source of law are legal transplants. It means that one takes from the other. It's very, very intriguing theory, and you can follow, for example, rules from the ancient Egypt to the ancient Crete to the Roman Empire, from Roman Empire to Byzantine Empire, from Byzantine Empire to Holy Roman Empire, and so on until nowadays. So the idea behind this theory is that the source of law that we usually use, okay, there are many sources of law, but the most used source of law is, let's say, copy-paste. Okay, to take from one side and to use it from one state and to use it in another state. And it is very intriguing theory. There are some critics, of course. You cannot say that all the rules that were created in human history were just copied or took from somewhere, because they must appear somehow. But I think that answer to your question is that the rest of the world just followed this idea of human rights,
even
and individual
unconsciously
rights.
not noting that they are in Europe rooted in the Christian values.
That can be our guilty, actually.
I wouldn't say it's a guilt,
because we never insisted that these, and maybe it's not bad that we did that. It just happened like that, but we never insisted to prove that these values, these ideas have Christian roots, and maybe that's why it was easier to adopt these ideas in some parts of the world.
So then we can come back to the role of Christian values in the legal systems in more concrete European aspect.
Yes. We can see, for example, in our region, let's speak about the countries that we, from which we are, and that are somehow in the center of our scientific work. The values, the Christian values, can be identified, as I said, in the constitutions. For example, if you take into account that the Constitution of Serbia prescribes that marriage is a communion of men and women, that is one example of the Christian influence on the constitutional provision. And for example, you can find almost similar definition of the marriage in the church rules. So just if you compare two texts, you will see that there are similarities, or if you want, they are
copy-paste.
Yeah, copy-paste, okay. So that is only one example. Then if we want to speak about gender equality, why not? You can trace the gender equality in Christian textbooks to the 2nd century, for example. Justin the Martyr, he developed this theory about men and women as just different forms of one human being. So this is much deeper than just, we believe that the idea of gender equality appeared a few weeks ago or few years ago, but actually it was formulated much earlier.
Just to bring up other examples, because there is a pending case in the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg regarding polygamy. So this is like a challenge on how to say Christian values, how the court would decide about this issue. Can you please elaborate on that?
Thank you. This is not the first time that the court has to deal with Christian values and to deal with issues that are connected closely to what Christians believe and what Christian societies look like. Maybe you remember the Lauzi case, the famous Lauzi case, and the crucifix in classrooms in Italy.
Yes.
So now we have different kind of challenge. And that has to do with migration, actually, because we are talking about a Muslim who has been who received international protection, and that is the reason why he wants to bring his second wife and all the kids in Netherlands, if I remember well. So here the court probably will have to implement the principle of proportionality and to assess what is the value that must be protected. From one side, there will be the reunification of his family and the protection of his private life, and on the other side will be the protection of public morals and the European way of life, if you want. So I can only hope that, like in some other cases, the court took this stance or accepted this opinion that the European way of life must be protected. It was in the case of Muslim women that and the ban on in France and the ban of putting veils on their heads. So there is this solution that the court found that the European way of life should be protected.
So this is how they sustained the prohibition of violence.
Prohibition of the veils. So maybe in this case, polygamy is forbidden in many European countries. So I think that this is really part of the European way of life.
Yeah, and that would have far-reaching consequences as a precedent. So coming back from the very concrete cases to the more general one, like questions, how do you see the identity-building nature of Christianity in Europe? Does it have an identity-building nature?
Yes, this is an ongoing discussion about the identity of Europe. What actually constitutes the identity of Europe? And the most of authors insist on the secularity and secularization as the resolution or the best way to express the European identity. However, the idea of secularity, of secular state, also has Christian roots, because in other faiths there is no clear difference between the secular and the sacred. You cannot find in other faiths this so clear difference between this world and the other world. You know, the of temporal and of the permanent and so on. But the idea of secularity, seculum means century, so of this century, of this time, of this period. This idea comes from this differentiation between this world and the world that will come in the future. Yes. Anyway, secularism or secularity of the state is the part of European identity, for sure. However, it does not mean that the impact of religion should be completely removed.
It cannot, in my opinion.
Hopefully, yes. But you cannot substitute the religion with secularism, or you will create from secularism religion. Then that can be also dangerous. So because secularism, and I make this difference between secularism as an ideology and secularity of the state, which is the separation
of
separation between state and church.
And the operational mode.
And they can cooperate, of course, because...
the operational mode, so it's like a fact, when we are distincting with the ideology of secularism.
While secularism tries to impose to others, like every ideology, the idea that religion should be removed from the public life. And here is very dangerous moment, that we have to make difference between public sphere, the public square, if you want, and the state sphere or the state as itself. So religion must, I believe, and I think that the European Convention and other human rights instruments impose to states to provide for religion to be part of the public sphere. Because the public sphere is like an arena in which everyone should enter and tell whatever they have to say. And then the others must be free to accept or not to accept. But that is how it should work, you know, how it should be operated by the state. To be open, to make open this public sphere, public space for all religions. And in that case, I think that that is the only way to protect the religious freedom, actually. Other ways, we have some limitations, and those limitations usually are not allowed, or there can be interferences with the freedom of religion or belief.
Looking at your key contributions to our academic activity, you are an expert of religious freedom, and you are also specialized on your own country, Serbia, but you are also familiar with Greece, and I think you made also the comparative law exercise. So what do you see as key challenges of religious freedom in Europe, if you move from Christian values now to the very right of religious freedom?
Look, at the moment, probably the most dangerous issue that religious freedoms are facing is the so-called securitization of religion. Securitization.
What does it mean?
Yes, it means that religious freedoms are limited or derogated because of security reasons. The best examples now we can find in Eastern Europe. For example, in Baltic countries, they have almost completely forbid or forbid Russian church because of security concerns. Mm-hmm. Or they insist that Russian church in these countries cut every ties that has with Moscow Patriarchate. Also, something similar happened in Ukraine. Something similar we saw in Montenegro a few years ago, mm-hmm. when the authorities there tried to ban Serbian Orthodox Church, or at least to expel the Serbian Orthodox Church from Montenegro for some ideological reasons. So I think that at the moment, and what is actually my fear is that you can see that even countries that have achieved a certain level of human rights protection, mm-hmm. like Estonia or Lithuania, they try to limit now or to derogate religious freedom in order to protect their security. Now, the key question here is, what is the red line? So what is, when you want to protect the religious freedom, what are the extent of this freedom that you cannot limit, for security reasons? Mm-hmm. I do understand that this is really difficult when you feel that some threat, and that maybe, or that religious organizations are used against you or used as a tool against the security of your country. Mm-hmm. So how to balance between this fear, or not only fear, the fact that maybe some religious organization is working against you, but not to violate the religious freedom.
And is there a recipe how to balance?
There is no universal recipe, as always.
Proportionality principles.
But there are ways to. It always should be, I believe, so on individual level. So if you have security threats, you have actually individuals that you can identify, and there is no need to punish the whole community. Mm-hmm. Maybe I think that would be the better way to solve this kind of problems, because if you force one religious community to and you intervene in its internal issues, like it is an internal issue of the community, whether it keeps ties with one patriarchate or the other, or with one center like Rome, or mm-hmm, not mm-hmm. with Rome. So if you try to intervene inside these questions, then you violate the autonomy of those organizations. And maybe today they feel threats from Moscow. What in the future we have another kind of threats. Mm-hmm. And if we accept that religion can be limited like that because of the security threats that we have, maybe in the future it can be abused for some
other
reasons that do not have nothing to do with security threats from outside, but maybe from inside. So it is very complex issue. I do understand both sides, and I do understand that there are concerns from both sides, but I think the worst thing to do is to make limitations on religious freedom, because religious freedom is a taproot of all other freedoms. Taproot is the main root that plants have, and then you have other smaller one. If you just take it historically, freedom of assembly actually originated from the struggle of Protestant groups to gather together and to celebrate daily ceremonies. Freedom of press is nothing started with a struggle for publishing Bible in languages that people can read. So
again, the Christian roots.
Yes, there are Christian roots. There are religious roots, but this is not just a fun effect or the coincidence. That is actually the fact that church brings democracy, and church in European context, or religion, if you want, in a general context, that church. You could see that in our cases. In 1990s, in the beginning, at the end of 1980s, or in the beginning of 1990s, that actually churches were those who brought democracy, and I would even say that without religion there is no freedom, there is no democracy, and in our context, without church there is no democracy, there is no freedom.
I like these statements. We will quote them at the end of this podcast as a headline. And what about religious symbols? Let's start by your country. Could you please describe us what is the situation, how the use of religious symbols in public spaces is regulated? Is it regulated?
I think that my conclusion was that they are not. It is not regulated. Actually, that is. Maybe we can say that is a custom of that we have, or customary law that we implement in these cases. Look, in all Serbian classrooms and public places, you can find crucifix or icons or some other religious symbols. On the flag you have religious symbols, of course. Also on the flags of and coat of arms and so forth. So this area is somehow under-regulated, actually. And I remember that during the conference that we had here in Budapest of the Central European Academy, I brought with me one small ball that actually my kid bought in a Chinese shop, actually, and I said, and that small ball had a Serbian flag on it, and my question was, who allowed to these people in China to print Serbian flag like that? Are there any rules that forbid something like that? But there are no rules, actually, because there is one explanation that if you promote the country by this way, it can be free, and it should be free. But however, does it mean that you can put it on the toilet paper? I don't know, or something like that. So it doesn't mean, some regulations I think are necessary. You cannot just leave it unregulated. And that's why I said that it is under-regulated.
But is there a need to regulate?
Yes, there are some criminal law protection. There is some criminal law protection, but that is for abuses of national symbols.
But coming back to the ball example, is it an abuse?
It is not an abuse, of course.
Obviously not, but where is the limit?
Yes, that exactly. Where is the limit? If there are no rules, it means that you can do whatever you want. It is very simple in our legal system.
So should there be a need for regulating the use in your views, in your scientific?
Yes, I think that always is better to do something before you have problem, not to react, but to make it to solve problems before they appear. So there are no problems at the moment, but I think that is not the reason to say that okay, we do not care anymore. I think quite the opposite. Now when we do not have any issues and problems, maybe it is the best moment to regulate to some extent the use of religious symbols. And national symbols as well. Because national symbols even have maybe bigger trade value, if you want, because of selling, some not only balls but different kind of.
And if we widen the circle, are religious symbols and the public use of them under pressure in other parts of Europe? In light of colliding with other religious groups?
In some countries, yes, they are. For example, we had this case in some of northern European countries that Christmas tree was forbidden because it is not. It is just Christian symbol and not, let's say, universal symbol for all faiths and so on. There are always these debates about should we say Merry Christmas or just hello and so on, because maybe the other person is not Christian and maybe can be offended by that.
But is it a category of the law or it's a category of habits, culture? Is there any individual who could base a claim on such a right that I am offended because I saw something which does not fit my religious belief? Do you think are we approaching a situation like this?
There were cases like that, but not regarding religious symbols or something like that. But there were cases of Christians who complained because of the movies that actually somehow blasphemized Christian faith and so on. And then the court, the opinion of the court was that in the modern society you must be prepared to hear something that can differs from your opinion, that can hurt you or that can be stressful or something like that. So there is no you cannot ban a movie or something like that just because it offends one part of
and
citizens.
If you look at this case from another angle, if there is like a cross in a classroom and it is removed based on a decision of the director, and if the Christian families would protest to put it back, could they establish any right vis-a-vis the authorities or the school?
It depends on the legal system. For example, in Italy, they have this rule that every class must have crucifix. We had an issue in Serbia that one parent asked from the school authorities to remove an icon that was placed there, but there were no legal
steps
outcomes of that.
But did
initiative.
He or she succeed?
No, because other parents then reacted and said that we are okay with that. We do not have any problem. So our children are also pupils in these schools, and they have the right to keep what is actually the problem, that it is not neutrality if you remove the icon. Because if there is still there or crucifix, when you remove it, that is actually the proof of animosity or any kind of
position
position that is against something that is not anymore neutral.
That's a very interesting question.
Yes, it is. Actually, the state neutrality is a very intriguing question. What does it mean that the state must be neutral in religious issues? Does it mean that all state bodies and the whole state must be completely neutral? If I do agree that courts must be neutral. Of course, they should do their work regardless of the religious affiliation or something like that. But for example, does the government has the duty of neutrality?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe the government has the duty to protect some
towards Christianity, or
yes,
or
or religion in general.
But then we end up with the question of whether those countries like Hungary and Poland who include the Christian value as a basic stone of the constitution. Are they right or wrong in the question of neutrality? Or is
that is exactly what I would like to say, that state policies must not be, or there is no any reason that they must be completely neutral regarding religion. Mm-hmm. So we can speak about courts, of course, on the other side, but the policy that is usually the matter of government, the policy can be somehow not neutral towards religion. And we can see it everywhere, in every country in the world, that governments do make some steps or some decisions that can affect religions or protect religions in a special way. So,
and actually, to be exact and more precise, they are not governments who are putting this provision into the constitution, but the constitutional power of the citizens who elect a parliamentary and constitutional majority, so that it is not the decision of a government, but a value decision of the legislative power or constitutional power to be not neutral in line with the nations.
That it is neutrality actually. Mm-hmm. If you take an example of prohibition in the United States, for example. Mm-hmm. A century ago, you know that the trade and the consumption of alcohol beverages was forbidden, mm-hmm. except for sacramental wines. Is it neutrality then to say that we mm-hmm. should not accept sacramental wines, and by that you would probably completely discriminate all the Christians in the United States? So neutrality doesn't mean that everything must be identical, in the same. So you can keep the neutrality by treating the same things similarly, mm-hmm. and different things differently. So in this case,
that sounds good.
Yes, in this case, it's equality actually. Yes. If you treat Christians, if you protect Christian values as a state or as a government, or actually with, as you very nice, you said that actually behind that decision is the sovereignty, the people who keep the sovereignty of the state. So if they have values that they need to protect, then it is not violation of neutrality, quite the opposite. That is the obligation of the state to
be in line with the will of
those who have sovereignty.
Time is running fast, but we still have to touch upon the most challenging challenge of migration and the relationship between religious freedom and migration challenge. How would you describe this?
Yes, this is an interesting example of how this field of law and religion actually enters into every field of law somehow. Mm-hmm. So even in migration law, you can find some issues related to religion, and that's why it is important to have people who deal with religion and religious issues, because then, of course, every expert of migration law can describe. But when you have insights on different issues that are connected with religion in other fields of law, and then you come to, for example, immigration law, you have some deeper thoughts and deeper understandings of the problem. So here,
what is a typical case, or what is a typical
the problem?
Is
the typical problem is that it's enough to come to a country and to say, I am, for example, Christian, persecuted in Iran, and I would like international protection. Then the other side that should examine your application has a very tough task. Then the other side has the task to examine your application and how you can check whether someone is really Christian or persecuted or not. As you probably know, there are many cases that in which they do not have any proof of persecution, and you cannot demand proofs of persecution because it's not necessary for them to bring that proof with them, or maybe really they cannot find or bring any proof of persecution. So there are only statement cases, when you have only the statement of the applicant, and you now have to evaluate somehow whether is he eligible for international protection or not.
To evaluate.
There are always some tools, because it cannot be blank check. That just to say I am.
It's not an automatized.
Yes, or even the worst thing is that you can say that I'm atheist. I cannot return to my country, because you can check whether someone is religiously affiliated or that have some religious affiliation. But atheists do not have any external way of manifesting their beliefs. However, in the case of religious applications, there is always a way to ask some questions that do not violate the freedom of religion of others, because people have this right, every citizen have this right to keep their religious affiliation inside. Yes, and this is the negative aspect of religious freedom, not to be forced to reveal religious beliefs and so on. But in that case, I had an interesting meeting with American colleagues who dealt with this kind of issue, and they had this solution that I think can be useful for everyone, and those are questions such as how often do you visit your church? Do you have a prayer book? How many pages does your
who's your priest?
Who's your priest?
A
can
family
be,
priest.
Of course. How many pages does your prayer book has? They have. Where is located your church in the town? So those are neutral questions. But they can reveal whether someone is really affiliated with one religion or not.
Because this is the basis in order to decide whether for that reason somebody is persecuted or not.
Yes,
this
exactly.
Is the precondition. Because if somebody is not deemed to be or qualify as a believer of any religion, then he or she cannot be persecuted either for that, if it's not objectively testified or how to say evidenced.
Yes. The problem is, as I said, usually with this kind of cases, when there are no other proofs than the statement. You have only one statement of the applicant, and this requires more efforts on the side of those who make decisions to enter into discussions and to try to identify whether this application is based on real facts and or not.
And how do you evaluate the case law of the ECJ, and the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg?
Look, regarding these issues, they always take this stance that is in favor of those who seek for international protection in most cases. And regarding religion, there are no many cases because usually state authorities approve their applications, and therefore I do not have a lot of information to share with you regarding religious issues. However, it is obvious that something should be done, and maybe this scrutiny of those applications should be done with more with a different approach. So you can there are always questions that can be done without violating the freedom of religion of others.
Is there any task de lege ferenda for the legislator in this field of migration
law
yes. And religious freedom?
I think that it would be useful to regulate these religion issues separately. So to take religion as a something special, let's say, like in many other fields of law, religion has special treatment in constitutional law, in many other fields, in criminal law. So maybe it would be useful to take into account these specificities of religion and those applications that are based on religion, and therefore to make some standards, which must be applicable in this kind of cases, without violation, always without any violation of the freedom of those who already have suffered before they came to seek for.
Hopefully, legislators are watching this podcast, so they can make use of your recommendation. We arrived at the final part, which is a sort of promotion part for the Central European Academy, because you are also our partner and you chose us. Would you recommend this academy for your students or for other country students? There are few students from my faculty that has been already involved in the activities of Central European Academy. I would say that, and that is the thing that I have already said to them, that working with Central European Academy has a lifelong impact, and that is why they should come and be involved. In my case, I can say that Central European Academy had a lifelong impact. So this cooperation, even if we stop it now, has had enough influence on me that will remain until the end of my career. Because of the information, or because of the human network, because of the friendships?
All of that, of course. Yes, networking is a very important privilege of this of Central European Academy, but also the way of thinking, the freedom to express what you believe and what you think that is the correct.
You can be yourself, actually.
Yes, okay.
Because I had this revelation that I can be who I am, and I'm not alone with this thought. And just because of my thoughts, I'm not discriminated or excluded. Plus, the Central Europe can show itself to the world, and together we are stronger. And the more cooperation we achieve, the more visible we will become for our Western partners and colleagues. And maybe they now really want to belong to us, to our circles, and because it is such a huge community. We grew into a community of more hundreds professors and students working together, sharing know-how, knowledge with each other. which is now a tangible result and a visible community from outside. And this was our aim to create our party, to create our forum.
Exactly. I remember when I started working with the Central European Academy, no one from my colleagues knew about it. Now everyone knows when we have conferences, and especially my younger colleagues, they come every September or October for the ASEA,
the Scientific Annual Conference.
Annual Conference, yes. And at our faculty, these days when they go to Budapest, everything is on pending. Everything. When you go to the administration, everyone say they are in Budapest. Everyone is in Budapest, so we will wait for them to return. And then even when we have, meetings of departments or something like that, those days that our colleagues come here for the conference are booked for Central European Academy, and I think that it is very important for our region that we have this kind of organization or this kind of platform, if you want.
Platform, yeah, it's a good word.
That we can that we can express ourselves, and the most important that there are no supervisors, there are no
censorship.
Censorship, yes. So we are here from this part of Europe, and we represent our culture, our legal systems, our scholarship. So that's who we are.
And the language, thanks to the common language, because we publish everything in English and the conferences are in English, it makes us also visible and readable for those who don't know how to speak in Serbian or Hungarian, because our languages are quite difficult for the mainstream Western European languages. And here, thanks to the English language, we can transmit our messages, we can show our legal heritage, and it might enrich also the whole European continental law.
That
science.
Was a very good decision of Central European Academy to publish all works in English. As I mentioned before, I can't say it's Greek to me, but I can say it's Hungarian to me. I do not understand a single word of Hungarian.
But in Greek you can speak.
So I think that was very wise. And by this, not only that we can read each other, but also the other colleagues from Western Europe, from Eastern Europe as well, from Asia, why not? They can be involved more with us, and probably that is the future of
this
our
is actually
communities.
the next step which we are trying to achieve, and for sure we are continuing our cooperation. So, dear Mr. Đukić, Professor, thank you for having this podcast interview with us, and dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us for this almost 1.5 hours, and I hope we can also advertise the fruitful cooperation in Central Europe through this podcast. So please follow us on the social media platforms, and we see each other in the next episode. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Central European Legal Insights. Don't forget to follow us on our social media channels for updates. To discover more conversations from the series, be sure to explore our other episodes. Thank you for listening.